It turns out that I have trogocytosis in my brain, and I didn't even know it. What is trogocytosis, and what should I do about it? Well, stay tuned.
Welcome to the A&P Professor. A few minutes to focus on teaching human anatomy and physiology with host Kevin Patton.
In this episode, I talk about how glial cells prune synapses in the brain. I mention a HAPS workshop I gave recently, and I talk about storytelling as a teaching strategy. My undergraduate students find human anatomy and physiology to be pretty challenging, and that seems to crank up a notch when they get to neuroscience. As a matter of fact, that's a well-documented effect, this fear or trepidation about neuroscience that occurs not just in undergraduates, but even in graduate students and medical students, and probably in us A&P teachers as well. I love neuroscience. I'm really fascinated by it. But I'll admit that I have episodes of this kind of trepidation when I'm wandering into a new area of neuroscience or an area that I just don't know much about ahead of time. Yeah, there's some fear there that I'm not going to understand it or it'll be too overwhelming for me. So we can only imagine what our undergraduate students are facing. So when we discuss neurons and other aspects of neuroscience, I think it's important for us to choose wisely in what we present to them. And when we're looking at the neurons, which is usually near the beginning of our story, depending on how you tell the story of neuroscience, we see that there are some overwhelming things that are essential for student understanding. They need to know what a neuron is. They need to know what the glia are, or neuroglia. They need to know the role of the neuron, and in doing that, they ought to know something about membrane potentials and how action potentials work, and they need to know about synapses and synaptic transmission and how neurotransmitters are involved in that. And boy, once you start to go down that road, even just the basics can get pretty overwhelming for a beginning student. So hence my advice to choose wisely. Well, here's some information that we probably don't want to get into in too much detail in a beginning A&P course. That's up to you, of course. You know your students and your program better than I do. But I think even if you're not teaching it to the students, this information might be useful to us as A&P instructors to increase our overall understanding so we can be better teachers of the basics to our students. This is a discovery that was published in Nature Communications recently. It's an article entitled Microglia Remodel Synapses by Presynaptic Trogocytosis and Spinehead Filopodia Induction. So what in the world does that mean, and what did they discover? Well, we already had this idea proposed for a long time and some evidence showing that the way learning and memory works is at synapses, at least partly at synapses. And we know that something is happening to change synapses in a way that strengthens memory, for example, when we're doing learning. There are probably multiple mechanisms involved, but what was proposed was that microglia get in there and do some pruning. And then as the synapses regrow, then that is going to form these new constructions, these new connections that the learning and memory constitutes this learning and memory that is induced by the memory-causing processes. So this new article says, well, it's not exactly the way many people thought it was, where the microglia come in and just start chopping away and gobble everything up. It's a little more refined than that. The evidence they present shows that something like phagocytosis, but a little bit different, called trogocytosis. Trogocytosis is based on the word part nibble or gnaw. So the phagocytosis is based on the word part phago, which means to eat or consume. So it's like the literal difference between eating something and nibbling on it. You're not really gobbling the whole thing up when you nibble on something. So trogocytosis by the microglia means that they go in and evidence shows what these researchers saw, they only go into the presynaptic part of the synapse. That is the little button or whatever structure there is reaching out from the presynaptic neuron toward the postsynaptic neuron to form that synapse. So it gobbles up just that presynaptic part of the little connection. And then they found something interesting, and that is that when the microglia make contact with the postsynaptic side, they're not nibbling there, but they are somehow inducing that spine that's there on the postsynaptic side to reach out to form filopodia, these little feet-like filaments that reach out, and they presumably are making a new connection with that presynaptic cell. So the microglia come in, they destroy the presynaptic side of the connection, and induce the postsynaptic side to reconnect. At least that's what I'm getting out of what I'm reading here in this article. But I'll put a link to that article from Nature Communications, along with other interpretive articles to go along with it. And you can read through it and see for yourself and incorporate that into your own understanding of how synapses work and how they can be altered by the glial cells, microglia specifically. And hopefully that will better inform what you are teaching your undergraduate A&P students in your A&P class. I recently had the opportunity to present a workshop at the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, HAPS, regional conference in St. Louis. And this workshop centered around things that I have tried and found to work in enhancing long-term learning, which is a topic that we have visited several times already in previous episodes of this podcast. So I recorded a version of that workshop for those that couldn't be part of our regional conference, and I've posted that at the approfessor.org. The specific URL is there in the show notes for this episode, and if you follow that link and go to the page, you can view the seminar in an outline format. But there are also many links that link you back to resources that address the various topics that are covered in that workshop. You might also want to explore some of the other online seminars or workshops that I have at the approfessor.org. Over the decades, I've come to appreciate the idea that good teaching involves storytelling. That teaching is a kind of storytelling. And I firmly believe that if we think of it as storytelling, if we acknowledge the fact that teaching is storytelling, our teaching becomes more effective. And what do I mean by storytelling in the context of teaching? Well, there's a wide spectrum of things that we do when we interact with our students in a course in ways that facilitate their learning. There are, of course, lectures and mini lectures and online lectures and discussions we lead and so on that are obvious opportunities for storytelling, telling the story of how the human body is built and how the human body functions. But when we approach our entire course as an opportunity for storytelling, it gets even better. It's sort of like a filmmaker or an amusement park designer, amusement ride designer, who thinks of it as telling a story. And so there's a beginning, a middle, an end. And if we think of that as a beginning, a middle, and an end, and take those things that we know about teaching and learning, such as learning outcomes that we expect, the place that we're kind of starting from, like what do we want the student to learn, and then how are we going to get there, and then how are we going to wrap it up at the end and conclude and pull all those threads together. We can do that when we're physically telling a story in the classroom, let's say in a lecture context, but we can also do that in the entire course design and the design of each component of that course. If we think of it as a story, then I think that it works better in our own minds, and therefore it translates better for the student. And once the student starts thinking of these as stories. And my students, I use that terminology with them. I'll say, remember when I told you the story of how the nephron works? And they start getting that mindset of these are stories, and that makes it more accessible to them, I think, than when they think of it as the lecture on the nephron. If it's the story about the nephron, wow, suddenly it takes on a whole different flavor than it did before. And it's not just using that terminology in presenting things the same way we've always presented them. I think it's important for us to think of them as a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and with protagonists and antagonists and good guys and bad guys and amazing things that happen and so on. And I think that where that starts is to understand that we are walking in the classroom and taking on the persona of a storyteller. So it's a kind of acting. And if you've ever heard professional storytellers or even amateur storytellers, I think you can kind of see the transformation that comes over people, especially if you have a friend or a family member or something that likes to tell stories. Sometimes their affect will change just a little bit, maybe a lot, when they get ready to tell some favorite story of theirs, especially if they're talking to children, but even when they're talking to adults and telling a story to adults. And I think a lot of us as teachers do that. And I think that's a great thing. It's a good thing to have that storytelling persona, that teacher persona that we walk in with, especially for those of us that are introverts. I think that if we think of walking into a classroom and we're naturally very shy in front of crowds and so on, but we think of it as an acting role that we have and we walk in, then it puts us and our students at much more ease, because now it's not Kevin, the teacher anymore. It's Kevin, the storyteller. And I'm going to come in and tell you some stories. And I'm an actor for that time that I'm spending with you. So that acting part is important. One aspect of that is that people usually want their storytellers to be living the story with them, sort of as if the storyteller is hearing the story for the first time as well. Most storytellers do not speak in a monotone and just kind of rattle off the events of the story and so on. They get somewhat dramatic. They move their arms a little bit. They move around a little bit. They act out certain parts. They change their voice at certain parts. And I think that if we do that, and not only that, but have fun doing it. I'll never forget, and I've mentioned before in this podcast that I used to be a lion tamer in the circus, and I spent a lot of years learning how to do that and going to circuses and watching other animal trainers and other circus performers and so on. And my mentors pointed this out to me, that you always go in and act like you're having fun. And if you act like you're having fun, then everyone around you will have fun. And then pretty soon, even if you weren't, you are now having fun. And psychologists tell us that happens. They often use it as a technique to help people who are having a hard time having fun or having a hard time smiling or being happy, is to, just smile a lot and you'll feel better. And maybe there's some physiological things that go along with that. My point being that if we walk into our classroom and consciously think about the fact that we're taking on a new persona, a persona who's going to have fun telling a great story. And then the next step is that most people in our classes, or most people who want to hear a story, have curiosity about certain things. And I think that our students have a natural curiosity about the human body. My theory is that everybody who lives in a human body has some level of curiosity about how the body is built and how it works. But I think our students in particular come in with that because they've been drawn to a career path that involves the human body. So they already have that curiosity. So we can start out with, did you ever wonder how the kidney does what it does? What does the kidney do? You got any ideas? And then move from there into, let me tell you about the nephron. The story of the nephron is an amazing story. It's the weirdest things that happen and the most unexpected things that happen. But at the end, we end up reaching our goal of maintaining homeostasis. And so, telling it as a story and having characters in that story, identifying the characters in that story, the different segments of the nephron tubule, for example, could be characters, or the ions and other molecules that are moving, glucose and so on, that are moving back and forth across the wall of the nephron. Those could be characters in our play. We have a lot of recurring characters in our stories, don't we? I often will say that. It's like, here's calcium again. Here's, our recurring character has come back in for another episode of A&P. So, having that story perspective is important. Having beginning, middle, and end is important. I think if we can introduce some conflict and resolution, that'll help. Talking about the nephron, we can talk about how, if a negative ion is pulled across the membrane, what are the positive ions going to do? We're going to have this electrical charge building up. Is that something that we want to continue? Or are we going to allow the positive ions to follow the negative ions, or vice versa? Are we going to pull these ions across and let the water just stay there? Are we going to have an osmotic imbalance? Are we going to let the water come across too? So we set up conflict, we identify conflict, and then we say, well, how is that resolved? How do things naturally occur? And a lot of times, the audience of the story, our students, they kind of know how it's going to go. Don't you have that experience when you're listening or watching stories? I know in movies, sometimes I'll feel like I'm getting to know a character and I can predict what they're going to do next, or especially in miniseries and television series and things like that, where you'll start to be able in your own mind predict, how a character is going to react. And I think if we set that up for our students, they can start to do that too. They can sort of tell what's going to happen when there's an electrical imbalance across a membrane, or an osmotic imbalance across a membrane, or any one of a number of other kinds of conflicts that they've seen resolved in other areas of the body. And when they do that, they're just not being good listeners to the story. They're starting to get to those higher levels, or maybe I should say deeper levels of understanding of how the human body works. And so they are just naturally being drawn to higher level thinking skills, to higher level understandings of what we want them to understand. I think another aspect of storytelling that can be very effective is when there's some shock and awe involved. And what I mean by that is like, oh my gosh, how can this happen? How could this happen in the body? How, is this really what we're going to do? If we think about all of the fluid that is filtered out of the glomeruli into the nephron, and we think, oh my gosh, you add all that up, that's gallons and gallons and gallons of water we're going to end up lost from the body. That's shocking. That is awesome. And then we resolve that. We say, well, wait a minute. That's, do we really pee 50 gallons a day? I don't think so. So something's got to happen. What could possibly happen before that fluid gets out of our body that can restore the balance and prevent us from drying out almost instantly? And so, if we are bringing that shock to the fore, if we're dramatizing that and bringing it out, and not only that, but acting shocked ourselves. Don't good storytellers do that? Don't they act surprised even though they've practiced this story a million times and probably have told it 1,000 times? But they do. They act out. They dramatize that shock. And I do that with my students. Like, oh my gosh, how can we do that? And they know that I'm not being totally sincere. They know that I know the end of the story and what's going to happen. But it helps to tell the story, and it helps them hear the story. I'll never forget a ringmaster, announcer in a circus that I saw several times. He's French, and even though I did see him in the United States, I also saw him over in Europe. And he's one of the best ringmasters I ever saw, even though I only understood about half of what he talked about because he usually spoke in French. I mean, he did do a little bit of English, especially when he toured in the United States, but he mostly announced the various circus acts in French. And he was so good. You don't think of the ringmaster as being one of the stars of the show, but he was always one of the stars of the show in whatever circus he appeared in. And the reason is that he became the storyteller. And he would not just announce an act, he would stay around and he would watch. And you could see him act out the shock and the awe when a high wire artist was going across and maybe was teetering a little bit, and you would see him and his face would change, and he would appear to be just as shocked as the rest of us. And he would laugh when there was a comedy circus act on, like maybe Comedy Acrobats or something like that. And he would act out in a very dramatic way. He would act out his reactions. And what that did was get us as the audience more involved in the circus act that we were seeing at that moment. And that's the kind of teacher I want to be. I want to be just like that ringmaster. I want to be expressing that shock and that awe and that amazement of the human body to maintain homeostasis under a wide variety of conditions. And even when bad things happen, can recover from it if things are happening normally. And we can be shocked and saddened when things get broken, when the heart valves don't work right, or when the kidney doesn't maintain homeostasis consistently in terms of our fluid and electrolyte balance. And one last thing that I'll mention, there are many other things about storytelling, but one last thing is to use a lot of pictures, don't use a lot of words. So I think anatomy and physiology, both ends of that, the anatomy part, the physiology part, lend themselves to visual storytelling, where we show a picture and walk our audience, our storytelling audience, through that part of the story. And then we change the scenery and we walk them through that part of the story. Putting up 25 bullet points in one slide is not going to help storytelling. What we should do is use a title, maybe one or two little bullet points, especially if there's subtitles of that story, to help the students understand sort of where we're going in that story. It's sort of like when you go to the theater and you look at the program. What you will see is a very, very short outline. It'll have Act 1, Act 2. It'll list the scenes and tell you some short little thing about each scene. Maybe it tells you where it occurs, or what major thing happens or could be happening in that scene. If we're going to be using slides or other visual aids, make them mostly pictures and make them be very few words. I think you'll tell a much more effective story. Your students will be listening to your story rather than trying to read the slide and copy it down if we do it that way. So a few storytelling tips for your next A&P class. Have fun with it.
The A&P Professor is hosted by Kevin Patton, professor, blogger, and textbook author in human anatomy and physiology.
Some excess material from segments in this episode were removed, then filtered out by the kidneys.